You're listening to Trek FM.
Hello everyone, and welcome to From There to Here, Trek FM's celebration of 50 years of Star Trek. I'm your host for this block, Daniel Proulx, and with me is...
A lizard, Brandon, and my tongue has fallen out.
Is there anything we can do to help? Do you want some pepperoni pizza, baby?
Pepperoni pizza!
Oh boy. Yes, we are here to talk about the infamous Threshold, as well as another Voyager episode, Meld.
We can't stop. We can't even stop to talk about this. Hit to Warp 10 right now. Let's go.
Then we'd be able to talk about, simultaneously, all Star Trek shows at all times.
Well, no, because it's not time travel. It's just location travel.
I don't know. Didn't you hear what he said? The future is the past, as the future is the present, and what? Anyways, listen.
All that I remember is that Beverly Crusher went to Warp 13 or 14 in All Good Things. That's all that I remember.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we'll talk about that. Don't worry. There's a lot of problems in this episode, but let's intro it. This is the episode where lizard babies come from. And I think it doesn't need any more introduction than that. Brandon, why don't you start? Tell me what you think about Threshold.
I think this episode is... What's the word I'm looking for? It's unfairly maligned. You know, it's the first 2/3 of the episode, I think, are actually quite fascinating. There's a couple of painful things in it. Like when he just screams out, "Pepperoni! God, do I want a pizza right now?" It's like that's pretty stupid. But what's happening to him and the fact that they're trying to come up with this new warp technology and how it messes up with him and he starts like dying and he can't breathe and he's allergic to the water and everything. I think it's really fascinating and really interesting. But the episode really just falls apart in the back third of the episode, you know. Once he, like, the evolving Genesis worms and lizards and lizard babies, it's weak, but it's not that bad.
I will admit, I will agree that this episode is not as bad as people tend to make it out to be. You know, I could think of 10 worst Star Trek, 100 worst Star Trek episodes, probably 10 worst Voyager episodes.
Man, we just talked about Alliances is way worse than this episode.
Yeah, I agree. Alliances is way worse than this because it's boring and there's also nothing in it. There are a couple of things that really bother me here. First of all, Brandon Braga. Okay, he wrote this episode and he wrote Genesis as well from TNG.
Okay. I love Genesis. Don't you dare say anything bad about
Listen,
Genesis.
Fine. If you can like Genesis, what I'm about to say doesn't really have. Somebody needs to sit this man down at a convention or in a hallway or something. He has the most confused misunderstanding of what the concept of evolution is. He doesn't understand it. This is not what happened. Even if you accepted all of these science fiction kind of sillinesses of, is this blah, 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 and you went warp a bazillion, and you went into the future, and all of a sudden, this is not how evolution works, man. You don't know what evolution is. Stop using it in your stories because you're doing it wrong, and it really bothers me. Anyways, that's one thing that bothers me, and of course, we have seen people go further than warp 10. In the original series, of course, different warp scale. We understand it now.
Right.
But you mentioned one just earlier.
Yes. Now, I had thought that they had redefined the warped scale for the next generation.
That's what I thought as well, yeah.
Yeah, so I understood the concept of warp 10. Now, I think it's odd that these ships can go warp 9. Like, Voyager's maximum sustained cruising velocity, as they say in Caretaker, is warp 9.975. And it's like this crazy curve that you can approach warp 10 but never reach it. So I like the idea that warp 10 is instantaneous travel. That's fine. I'm all okay with that, and that they're trying to achieve that. Great. But, you know, it's one of those inconsistencies in Star Trek, you know, when somebody points out, you know, why they hate the Kelvin universe because of X. It's like, well, there's 729 episodes in Star Trek that contradict each other in some way. You know, like there's so much there that there's contradictions all over the place in Star Trek. So honestly, even that doesn't bother me. You know, why did Scotty come out of the transporter room and ask for Kirk when he watched him die on the Enterprise B? You know, like, does that ruin everything about Star Trek for me? No, it doesn't. It's just one of the inconsistencies that happens. It's like, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you're saying, but it's like there are just certain things, and what's the point of existing in this universe, telling stories in this universe, if you're just going to disregard the rules that you've placed? Context matters. This is why canon matters as well, because you are telling stories, but just as important as the plot of the stories is the situation in which they happen. Context is king, and it matters. And Brandon Braga, no stranger to Star Trek. He should have known better at this point. And so I don't know. You can say that, but it's just frustrating because, of course, we're minorly quibbling. This doesn't really matter in the story, but it is kind of frustrating because it's like, and they even mention it. Once you let this cat out of the bag, you also change the future of Star Trek as well. To think that if they actually did this thing. And this is you mentioned the Kelvin timeline. This is one of my biggest problems, and not just me, many people's biggest problems with Into Darkness was this, that you could just teleport from planet to planet. You now fundamentally change the structure of that universe. You break space travel. And if you break space travel in an episode of Star Trek, you can't go back from that. You destroy the foundation of that universe, and what's the point of even getting a starship anymore? You can just teleport from place to place. Right. So yes, I think that's one of those things that you don't do. You don't go beyond that point, or you kind of really fundamentally have a serious problem.
So I've got the perfect solution to this. So since it violates the canon and the continuity and what we understand, all we have to do is get rid of the episode. So let's just completely get rid of All Good Things, since that's the episode that violates the continuity with Warp 14.
No. Well, okay. I see what you're saying.
We'll
and
keep
that's
Threshold, and we'll get rid of All Good Things.
It's not the fact that it quote unquote goes past Warp 10. If you want to use the terminology, that's not a huge deal. What it does though is it gives them a capability that they should never have. You should never have the ability to teleport anywhere you want in existence in the universe, because that is what I'm saying is fundamentally changing everything.
See, but I buy it in Threshold more than I buy it in Into Darkness, because in Threshold, the way that I understood the warp thing is that you can approach Warp 10 but never get there, because Warp 10 is instantaneous travel. I can buy that concept. I can grasp that more than I can grasp I can transport from Earth to Kronos, because that's a technology that's beaming and stuff. So maybe that's just me choosing to understand one over the other, but I don't know. To me, yeah, he reached Warp 10 and he was everywhere. It happened for a second. He's in the history books, and it's just the weird thing is the lizards.
The weird thing is the lizards, yeah. But so we just went into a whole thing there. We probably glossed over a lot, but I don't think either of us hate this episode as much as is commonly held. But is there anything else that you want to talk about or mention before we move on?
Well, I just wanted to point out, you kind of mentioned it too, but when I was writing down my notes, my last note on this episode was human evolution ?
Oh man, that annoys me so much.
But we get the continuation of Michael Jonas's mole plot. So that happens. So he's giving them the information on it. The episode falls apart for me when he pulls out his tongue. Like that's where I'm just like, whoa, okay, this is just odd. But like some of the other things too that happen before that are weird. Like when he can't process oxygen, and when the water gives him that allergic reaction, I think is really, really, really neat. So again, I think this is a over maligned episode, and it's unfairly maligned. Because there are worse episodes of Star Trek, and they're trying for something different is what they've done with this episode.
I will agree, it is not the worst, but it is one of the dumbest. So
this episode is not in my top 700.
Yeah, I'm with you. And you know what? That I think is the biggest compliment we're going to give Threshold today. So let's move on to Meld. Meld is the one we get to meet Ensign Suter, and there's a murder aboard the Voyager. So what do you think about Meld?
I think going into the episode like this, when you see the bad guy from Lord of the Rings, you know that he's going to be major in the episode.
I shrug. Not a Lord of the Rings fan.
Oh, anyways, he played. I don't even know the guy's name, but he's in Lord of the Rings. He's been on Deadwood. Brad Dourif is the character actor's name. He's been on X-Files. Like, this guy's been in everything, right? So he's such an outstanding actor that when you get somebody of his caliber on here, like, you know he's going to be major. What I like this episode a lot. I think this episode is really, really good and a really fascinating watch. And one of the things that every time I watch it, like, really shocks me and throws me for a loop is that the murder is solved by the end of Act 1. So, like, it's a completely different story than what you're expecting, you know, because you're expecting this murder Matlock investigation to go the whole episode, and it's like by the end of the first commercial, you're like, yeah, I did it, whatever, I didn't like the guy, and Tuvok's just like, huh? So and then it takes this sharp turn, and it's like Tuvok's like, I can't accept that. There has to be a logical reason for this, and that makes sense because he's a Vulcan, and he requires logic, he requires a motive. But when he goes and he does this mind meld, and there's this transference of calm onto Suitor and anger onto Tuvok is fascinating, and it's really interesting to watch from both sides of it. It's interesting to see how much it helps Suitor and what happens later on with his character, but honestly, it's really fascinating. And the scene when Tuvok, like, they have to lower his emotional defenses or whatever they call it, and he's going crazy and he's like banging his head against the force field, like, honestly, that is a pretty intense scene, and I like watching it because I'm just like, oh my goodness, when I'm watching it.
Yeah, Suitor's great. I love Suitor. Really interesting character. And I agree with you. I do wish they kind of had another excuse, and this is nitpicking. I wish they had another excuse for, like, Tuvok has said he's been studying violence for 100 years. He's been doing this. This is not his first rodeo. Is essentially what's happening. So I feel like he can understand senseless violence. Maybe not understand it, but at least it's not shocking to him. And it's not this big revelation that he just can't wrap his mind around. I feel like he should be logical enough to be like, okay, fine, you just did it because it was an impulse. You just had an impulse and you did it. There was no reason behind it. And so I just wish there was some other excuse they could have given him to do the first mind meld so all this other stuff happens. It's a nitpick. It's a tiny nitpick. But yeah, I agree with you. The scene when he's in the brig and they do the meld and they switch personalities. It's not personalities, but they switch characteristics. Really interesting stuff. Really good acting by both of those people, both the actors. And it's really cool to kind of see them do that and to see this transformation. I really like this episode. It's really an interesting idea. And Suitor himself calls a mind meld an act of violence, of penetration in this. And it's kind of interesting to see something that we've kind of always looked at as a positive, kind of a useful tool, as something maybe not so benign when you go back, especially in light of something like Star Trek 6.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, it's interesting, like, because you look at things from different points of view in this episode. You know, should we talk about the fact that Tuvok strangled Neelix?
I know you mentioned a little while ago that you like Neelix, but I think maybe that was a bit of wish fulfillment for the audience, for a lot of the audience who don't like Neelix. I'm indifferent on Neelix. Sometimes he is annoying, sometimes he's good. But the way he was played in that simulation, I would have strangled him too, honestly.
Dude needs some control.
I mean, to be fair, he was putting his hands on Tuvok. So,
in his mouth.
Yeah, it was a funny scene. It was. I keep wanting to talk about the next episode with Suitor in it, and I know we shouldn't do that. I just like Suitor. I like him as a character, and I like what happens to him. I guess that's all I want to say. Like you said, and every time I hear this episode discussed, it's talked about how Brad Dourif, this bigger name, big guest star. I've actually never seen him in anything else, so I'm not aware of him, but I imagine that's why he wasn't. I would have just loved for him to become a good secondary character, like a Garrick for Voyager, just because he's so interesting and so faceted, and like if we could see this struggle, go on for longer, and maybe he loses sometimes, and maybe he was like, that would be, it's a what if, but it could have been really cool.
Okay, well, you need to stop watching Breaking Bad and go and watch Deadwood, because he's in Deadwood. Okay, so he plays a doctor in Deadwood. He's great. And did you never watch season 1 of the X-Files?
I've never seen the X-Files.
Okay, he's in an episode from season 1 of the X-Files is what I know him to as well. This episode does bring up a really interesting discussion and topic as well, and that's the question of punishment on something like this. Like what do we lock this guy up for 70 years? Do we kill him? Like what do we do? And Tuvok is very right when he's lost his emotional control. He's like, yeah, you want to lock him up so he can have the comforts of his apartment for the next 70 years. Well, I think that guy's sister might have a problem with that. What do you think, Janeway? And but they don't kill people anymore. Like the only reason they're going to kill you is if you go to Talos 4, right? So, and he didn't go to Talos 4, so it's like, what are they going to do with him? Do they put him in the brig? Well, that's not very feasible either. So,
I do like a couple of things about that. I like that Tuvok mentions that as an option, and Janeway is immediately put off and immediately flabbergasted. She said, "No, we don't do that anymore," which I think is a pretty strong. Star Trek is saying something very strong there, I think, making a very strong point about it. Of course, Tuvok breaks down and has some things to say later about it. But you're right. It does it leads to this interesting conversation about what is law and order in the future, what is the punishment that they can do. And, of course, we know what ends up happening. He does end up getting just kind of contained in his quarters until later on, which I think is probably the best option there. But Janeway very steadfastly never even considered capital punishment as anything close to an option.
Yeah, you got it. A great episode. I love this one. I think this is a highlight for the show, not just season 2, but for the show.
It's good stuff. All right. Well, that's all we have to say about Threshold and Meld. Two interesting episodes to kind of cover back to back. But, Brandon, where can people find you if they're not listening to this episode of From There to Here?
You can find me on many more episodes of From There to Here, as well as on the network with Melodic Treks, which is all about the music of Star Trek. And I guess I haven't said it, but you can find me on Twitter at Brandon Mutala. And every once in a while I poke my head up and I see what's going on in the Babel Conference, which is our Trek FM listeners only group. And where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter at OneUpDan. That's the number 1, not the word.
Excellent. We won't be back tomorrow, but there will be somebody else, and they will probably not be lizard babies. So Hopefully. Stay tuned tomorrow.